There's a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too hard or sleeping too little. It's the exhaustion of always looking, always reaching, always turning the next page, hoping something will finally click into place. You've consumed the content, tried the methods, listened to the voices that promised clarity. And yet, deep beneath the surface of a life that might even look put together to everyone else, something remains unsettled, not loud enough to call a crisis, but present enough that stillness never feels completely safe. This isn't a failure of effort. It's not a lack of discipline or intelligence. It's something far more quiet and far more specific. Some part of you has never been truly seen, never been met with honest attention. And what isn't brought into the light doesn't disappear. It waits. It shapes itself into patterns, into overreactions, into relationships that feel strangely familiar, into a searching that never seems to end. This video isn't another map to somewhere else. It's an invitation to stop treating your inner life like a problem to solve and start recognizing it as something to finally inhabit. Carl Jung, the psychiatrist who spent his life mapping the territory most people spend their lives avoiding, once said that people don't suffer because life is cruel. They suffer because they live inside a story their own mind created, and then forget they're the ones writing it. The overreactions, the loops, the relationships that drain you, the patterns you can't break, none of these are random. They're signals. They're the psyche's way of asking for attention. When you stop chasing the next insight and begin turning toward what you've always looked away from, something shifts. Not dramatically, not like fireworks, but quietly enough that one day you realize the things that used to own you no longer even interest you. Stay here for these next minutes, not because I have something to sell you, but because what you've been searching for might not be in the next video. It might be in the space you create when you finally stop running and start seeing. Why the search never ends. Number 1, why the search never ends. Think about the last time you finished something you'd been working toward for a long time. A goal, a milestone, a level of understanding you thought would finally bring a sense of arrival. Maybe it lasted a day, maybe a week. But soon enough, without even deciding to, your mind was already building the next target. Not because you're greedy, not because you're broken, but because the engine behind the search was never the goal itself. It was something underneath. Carl Jung observed this pattern in nearly everyone who came to him. Not just people in crisis, but people who from the outside had every reason to feel complete. He noticed that many of us aren't actually searching for answers. We're searching for a way to avoid the silence that follows when the answers stop working. There's a man I remember, not a client, just someone whose path crossed mine in a way that stayed with me. His name is Michael, and by every external measure, Michael had built a life that most would envy. He ran a successful architecture firm, had a family that loved him, traveled when he wanted. But late one evening, after a conversation that had drifted far from business, Michael said something I haven't forgotten. He said, "I don't know why I can't just sit still. Every time I try, I feel like I'm forgetting something important, like there's something I should be doing." Michael wasn't describing a lack of purpose. He was describing a self that had never learned how to simply be without becoming. From a Jungian perspective, this is what happens when the ego has never formed a genuine connection to the self. When the center of your inner world hasn't been established, the ego has to manufacture movement constantly, not because movement is wrong, but because stopping feels like vanishing. Think of it this way. Imagine you're driving a car at night, but the dashboard lights are so dim you can't see your speed, your fuel level, or your direction. To compensate, you keep driving faster, hoping that more motion will somehow give you more information. But speed doesn't create clarity. It only creates the illusion of progress. The human psyche works the same way. When your inner dashboard is dark, when you can't see what's really there, you keep moving, Keep searching, keep consuming, because stopping would mean confronting the fact that you don't know where you are. Jung wrote a line that cuts straight through this. He said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." That single sentence holds the entire secret of why searching becomes endless. When your gaze is fixed on the external, on the next achievement, the next relationship, the next piece of knowledge, you're not actually solving the problem. You're dreaming that the solution exists somewhere out there. And because it doesn't, you have to keep dreaming forever. The signature of unconscious searching is that it never lets you land. Every time you arrive somewhere, it builds the next destination. Not because you're ambitious, but because if you stopped, you'd have to feel the emptiness that's been there all along. And that emptiness, here's the part Jung understood that changes everything. That emptiness isn't a sign that you're lacking. It's a sign that something deeper is trying to surface. Imagine you're standing by a lake that's been frozen for a very long time. For years, you've been walking on the surface, and because the ice is thick, you've assumed the solidity goes all the way down. But one day, you notice a thin crack. If you're like most people, your first instinct is to step away from the crack, to find thicker ice, to keep walking somewhere safer. But what if the crack isn't a danger? What if it's a sign that beneath the ice, the water is finally beginning to move? Jung didn't treat searching as something to eliminate. He treated it as proof that an inner thaw is beginning. When you stop misunderstanding searching as a chase for something missing, and start recognizing it as an invitation to turn inward, everything changes. The search doesn't stop, but its direction reverses. Instead of asking what you're still lacking, you begin to ask what in you has never been touched. Those two questions sound almost the same, but they lead to completely different destinations. One keeps you running. One brings you home. If this part stirs something in you, leave a short sentence in the comments. Just something like, "I'm still here," or "I choose to look." Not as a performance, but as a quiet marker for yourself. A way of saying that from this moment the search is no longer unconscious wandering, but conscious return. The world you're actually living in. Number 2, the world you're actually living in. And now we have to go deeper. Because if searching isn't about missing answers but about the way you're experiencing life, then what needs attention isn't out ahead of you. It's the place where all experience is created in the first place. Carl Jung made a claim that can feel unsettling at first. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. He said we don't live in reality. We live in our psychological version of reality. Jung wrote something deceptively simple. He said, "The psyche is real." What he meant was that your inner life isn't a secondary reflection of the real world. It is the world you actually inhabit. Everything you call your life passes through an invisible filter made of memories, fears, beliefs, expectations, and wounds that have never been fully seen. You don't react to events. You react to the meaning your mind assigns to those events. And most of that meaning was assigned a long time ago, in moments you couldn't choose, by a mind that was just trying to survive. This explains something we've all witnessed but rarely understood. Two people can go through the same situation and come out completely differently. One person hears criticism and feels attacked. Another hears the same words and feels informed. One person sits in silence and feels peaceful. Another sits in the same silence and feels abandoned. The world didn't contradict itself. The world was received through different psychological structures. And those structures, here's the part that matters, were built before you had any say in the matter. There's a figure in Greek mythology named Philomela, who was silenced in a way that Jung found deeply symbolic. Philomela had her tongue cut out to prevent her from telling the truth about what had been done to her. But she didn't stop communicating. She wove her story into a tapestry, showing the world what she couldn't speak. Jung saw Philomela as an image of the human condition. Not because we've all been literally silenced, but because most of us carry inner truths that have never been translated into words. They exist in us as feeling, as pattern, as reaction, but they've never been brought into consciousness where they can be seen clearly. And because they've never been seen, they run the show from behind the curtain. Modern psychology has a term for this. They call it implicit memory. It's the memory your body holds of experiences your mind never fully processed. You don't remember the moment something happened, but you remember the feeling. And when a present situation resembles that old moment, even vaguely, your body reacts as if the past is happening again. Jung understood this long before neuroscience confirmed it, but he added a layer that science doesn't always reach. He said these implicit patterns aren't just glitches. They're attempts by the psyche to get your attention. They're the tapestry Philomela is weaving, hoping you'll finally stop and read it. Imagine you're in a room where the lighting slowly changes throughout the day. In the morning, everything looks cool and sharp. By afternoon, the light warms, colors deepen. By evening, shadows lengthen, and the room feels completely different. If you don't know the lighting is changing, you'll believe the room itself is transforming. But the room stays the same. Only the light falling on it shifts. Your inner life works exactly like that. The world doesn't change as much as you think it does. What changes is the light you're carrying, the psychological state you're bringing to each moment. And if you don't know that your own inner light is shifting, you'll keep believing the problem is always out there. Jung never told anyone to deny their psychological reality. He knew that no one lives without a filter. What he emphasized was becoming conscious of the filter. The moment you realize you're reacting not to what's happening, but to what a situation awakens inside you, a tiny gap appears. In that gap, you're no longer fully controlled. You begin to observe, rather than simply react. And observation, pure observation without judgment, is the beginning of freedom. The lesson here isn't to dismiss the world, it's to reorder your relationship to it. Before anything reaches you, you touch it first with your mind. And if you don't recognize that, you'll keep fighting shadows, while the real source of light remains unseen, when the outer world becomes a mirror. Number 3. When the outer world becomes a mirror. Once you accept that you're not living in raw reality, but in your interpreted version of it, something shifts in how you see everything. The outer world stops being just a place where things happen to you. It starts to look like a reflective surface. The things that hit you hardest, the people who irritate you most, the situations that hook you emotionally, these are no longer just random events. They become clues. Carl Jung had a precise word for this mechanism. He called it projection. Not in the casual way we use the word today, like blaming others for our problems. Jung meant something much more specific and much more useful. He meant that the mind tends to take whatever hasn't been made conscious and place it onto the outside world. Then you react to it as if it belongs out there, when really it's been coming from inside you all along. Jung wrote a sentence that can completely reframe how you understand your relationships. He said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." This doesn't mean other people are never wrong. It doesn't mean you should accept bad behavior. It points to something more subtle. The intensity of your reaction often says more about what's being touched inside you than about the person standing in front of you. A woman named Sarah once wrote to me about a pattern she couldn't understand. She said that whenever she encountered someone who was very confident, very direct, very unapologetic about taking up space, she felt a wave of irritation so strong it surprised her. Intellectually, she knew these people weren't doing anything wrong. But her body wouldn't listen. She found herself avoiding them, criticizing them internally, feeling drained in their presence. She asked me, "Why do I keep attracting these people?" From a Jungian view, the question needs to be reframed. Not why do I attract them, but why do they affect me so strongly? When a reaction repeats with high intensity, It's almost never just about the present moment. It's the voice of an inner part that has never been acknowledged. Maybe it's the confidence you learned to suppress. Maybe it's the directness you were punished for as a child. Maybe it's the need to take up space that you were taught was selfish. That part of you didn't disappear just because you learned to live differently. It went underground. And now it's using the outer world to get your attention. Imagine standing outside on a sunny day. Everything casts a shadow. You can look at the shadow of a tree and complain that it's too dark, too large, too in the way. But the tree isn't deciding the shape of its shadow. The sun's position is. Your inner life works the same way. When something inside you is pushed out of consciousness, it casts a shadow onto the world. And you react to that shadow while the real source of light, the real source of the pattern, is inside you. This is why some relationships become obsessive beyond reason. Why do some people hold enormous emotional power over you, even when they're not doing anything extraordinary? Not because they're more special than anyone else. Because they're standing in exactly the place where an unseen part of you is trying to reach the light. If you don't recognize this, you'll keep changing jobs, changing partners, changing cities. And the same feelings will keep finding you, only with different faces and different names. Jung didn't say stop reacting. He didn't say shame yourself for having emotions. He suggested something far more practical and far more powerful. Move from reaction to observation. Observation not for judgment, but for recognition. The moment you ask, what in me is being touched right now? You create a small distance between yourself and the projection. In that distance, you're no longer completely dragged along. You begin to reclaim your center. This stage isn't about turning every problem into your fault. It's about reclaiming your agency. When you see the world as a mirror, you stop fighting every reflection. You can look back at yourself first, not to fix, not to blame, but to understand. And that understanding changes how the world touches you. Here's something you can try. Next time someone triggers a strong reaction in you, don't rush to decide who's right or wrong. Don't analyze them. Just pause long enough to feel what's rising in your body. Then quietly ask yourself, what in me was just touched? And what is it trying to have seen? You don't need an instant answer. Just hold the question there, in silence and attention. Often that simple pause begins to loosen something. If you've ever had a moment where you realized the world in front of you was reflecting something deeply personal inside, share that in the comments. Not to be right, not to perform, just as a reminder that many things we think come from outside are really quiet invitations to turn back inward. Why patterns keep returning. Number 4. Why patterns keep returning. So if the world is a mirror, why do the same kinds of experiences keep showing up year after year, no matter how much you change? You leave one relationship only to find yourself in another that feels eerily similar. You leave one job and the same dynamics reappear with different colleagues. You tell yourself you've learned, you've grown, you've done the work. And then something happens and you're reacting the same old way, surprising yourself with how little has actually shifted. Carl Jung had a blunt answer to this, and it's not comforting, but it's sharply accurate. He said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Jung wasn't saying the unconscious is your enemy. He was saying that as long as you can't see what's operating within you, it will keep steering from behind. And because you can't see the driver, you'll keep calling the road destiny. History is full of examples, but one that stays with me involves Howard Hughes, the aviation pioneer and billionaire. By any external measure, Hughes had achieved more than most humans could imagine. He built empires, broke records, shaped industries, but as his life went on, something strange happened. His patterns didn't expand with his success. They tightened. He became obsessed with detail, then with contamination, then with isolation. The same mind that had built extraordinary things began building prisons. What looked from the outside like success was from the inside a loop that kept repeating, only more intensely. The turning point never came for Hughes, not really. But his life shows what happens when patterns aren't seen. They don't go away. They just find new forms. Modern neuroscience explains this in language Jung would have recognized. The brain learns through repetition. Strong emotional experiences, especially early ones, carve pathways in your nervous system. When a present situation resembles an old one, even vaguely, your brain doesn't start from scratch. It activates the most familiar pathway. This is efficient for survival. It's terrible for freedom. It means you're always living the past in the present, unless you do something to interrupt it. Jung went deeper. He said the unconscious doesn't speak in words. It speaks in patterns. When an experience hasn't been fully processed, it doesn't disappear with time. It waits. And when conditions are right, it returns in the form of a familiar situation, a familiar kind of person, a familiar feeling. Not to punish you, to force you to stop exactly where you once moved too quickly. Think of it like reading a book but skipping a chapter. You can keep reading. You can finish the book. But the story will always feel slightly off, slightly incomplete. And if you read it again, you'll sense the same gap. The only way through is to go back and read the chapter you skipped. Jung believed that repetition in life is exactly that. It's the skipped chapter, asking to be read. What makes repetition so painful is that it often shows up exactly where you believe you've already overcome it. You think you're more mature, more aware, more healed. Then a small situation happens and you react the old way so fast, you shock yourself. Jung didn't see this as failure. He saw it as proof that some part of you hasn't yet been integrated. Not every part of a person grows up at the same time. Some parts get stuck in very early moments. And those parts keep reacting as if you're still living in the old context, still facing the old danger, still needing the old protection. Most people try to break the loop with willpower. They force themselves to think differently, act differently, be more positive. But Jung understood that willpower can't replace consciousness. You can't command the unconscious to stop. You can only allow it to be seen. The moment you recognize, this feels familiar, a small distance appears. In that distance, you're no longer completely swept away. And right there, a reversal happens. Repetition is no longer proof that you're broken. It becomes proof that life is patiently sending the same message until you're ready to receive it clearly. The core lesson here is simple, but life-changing. Only what is made conscious can stop. When you stop asking, "Why does this keep happening to me?" and start asking, "What in me keeps repeating this?" the circle begins to lose its power, not because you fight it, because you understand it. And here, a new boundary appears. When you can see the repeating pattern, you face a choice you didn't have before. Continue living as if everything comes from outside, or begin taking inner responsibility for what's operating within you. Not to blame yourself, to reclaim yourself. That boundary is exactly where the next part of the journey begins. The difference between responsibility and self-attack. Number 5. The difference between responsibility and self-attack. As you enter this stage, what changes isn't just what you see, but how you stand in front of what you've seen. The loops are no longer mysteries. But now a thin line appears. Either you move deeper into genuine awakening, or you unconsciously return to the old pattern under a new layer of insight. And that line is decided by how you understand responsibility. In Jungian psychology, responsibility never means self-condemnation. When people begin to see their role in their own suffering, the ego often grabs that moment and flips the script. Instead of blaming others, it starts blaming itself. The form changes. but the mechanism stays the same. You stop saying, "They did this to me," and start saying, "I'm terrible for being like this." It sounds more mature. It sounds like growth. But in truth, you're still being driven by an unconscious voice. Only now it wears your face. Jung wrote a sentence that should be written on the wall of every self-help space. He said, "We cannot change anything until we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." This isn't a call to passivity. It's not an excuse for every behavior. It draws a boundary. Inner responsibility begins not by judging where you went wrong, but by accepting what is, even when it makes you uncomfortable. Imagine wearing glasses with the wrong prescription. Everything is slightly blurred, but because you've worn them so long, you assume the world is simply like that. Self-attack is taking the glasses off and hitting yourself for seeing badly. Responsibility is simply adjusting the prescription. The world doesn't change, but your seeing becomes clear. In daily life, the difference shows up subtly. There are moments when you realize you're reacting too strongly to something small. A comment, a look, a situation that shouldn't trigger you, but does. If in that moment you tell yourself you're weak, broken, or hopeless, you've slipped into self-attack. You're still inside the same lens. Now you're just using it to judge yourself. Responsibility doesn't work that way. It simply notes that a familiar reaction is arising, and that this reaction doesn't fully belong to the present. Jung emphasized that consciousness isn't a moral attitude. It doesn't ask whether you're good or bad. It only asks what's operating here that hasn't been seen before. When you blame yourself, you're still caught in the story of yourself. When you take responsibility, you step out of that story and begin to see the structure behind it. Many people believe self-attack is a sign of inner work because they've stopped blaming others. But Jung saw clearly that self-attack is still identification. The ego is still at the center, still busy with who you are, whether you have value, whether you're good enough. Inner responsibility is different. It removes you from that center and places you in the position of the observer. From that position, you don't need to become an ideal version of yourself. You only need to see clearly the version that's present right now. The essence of this part is simple. Responsibility doesn't demand that you change immediately. It doesn't force you to be calmer, more positive, or heal faster. It simply invites you to stay with what's happening long enough that it no longer controls you from behind. When a reaction is seen in the light of consciousness, it gradually loses power. Not because you suppress it, because you're no longer fused with it. And here, the deeper meaning of this title becomes clear. This may be the last video you need doesn't mean you'll never struggle again. It means that when you understand responsibility correctly, you stop searching for awakening by hurting yourself. You stop using insight to attack what's imperfect and start using it to illuminate what you've never seen before. When responsibility is placed in the right place, inner life changes rhythm. You no longer react blindly, but you also don't force yourself to be different immediately. You can recognize the moment a reaction arises. Feel it in your body, in your breath, in the stream of thought, without labeling, without concluding. Each time you do that, you withdraw a little power from the unconscious and give it to consciousness. Not through tense effort, through presence. Before this journey reaches its final point, allow yourself to pause for one beat. Not to analyze, not to fix, not to judge, just to be still in this moment. Slow your breathing if it helps. In that quiet space, the most important thing doesn't need to be spoken. It begins to be felt. Why this might be the last video you need. Number 6. Why this might be the last video you need. By now, the searching has quieted. Not because you hold a complete answer, because you're no longer standing in the old place asking the old way. When your inner anchor resets, the impulse to rush naturally slows. You no longer search to escape the feeling of lack. You no longer need another explanation to reassure yourself that you're on the right path. And in that slower rhythm, the reason this might be the last video you need becomes clear. Not because everything is finished, because you've begun to remain where you truly are. Jung said something very direct about this. He said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." He wasn't talking about dramatic suffering. He meant the discomfort that comes when old structures, old understandings, old searching begin to lose their place. When you stop chasing familiar answers, a gap appears. That gap used to scare you. It used to drive you to keep searching, keep consuming, keep moving. But if you stay in that gap long enough, you'll discover something. This gap isn't emptiness. It's space, and space is where consciousness can finally stand, no longer pulled by the unconscious. Imagine you've spent years walking on a bridge that always trembles slightly. Not enough to collapse, but enough that you have to tense your body to keep balance. For a long time, you believed the tension comes from the bridge, from the wind, from circumstances outside. You learn to walk faster, grip tighter, adapt better. But one day, you stop in the middle of the bridge. And in that stopping, you realize what exhausts you isn't the bridge. It's that you never reset your own center of gravity. With a small inner adjustment, the trembling no longer controls you the way it did. The bridge doesn't change, but how you stand on it does. For Jung, this is the moment the unconscious stops being the driver. When you're no longer driven by impulses that haven't been made conscious, inner life becomes more orderly. Not because you're controlling better, because you're no longer fighting what's happening. Consciousness now doesn't judge, it witnesses. And witnessing, in Jung's understanding, is always the beginning of freedom. Literature captured this state perfectly through a character named Leopold Bloom in James Joyce's Ulysses. Bloom isn't a hero. He isn't a seeker of profound truth. He's an ordinary man living through one very ordinary day. But through his complete presence with small things, footsteps, memory, sensations in his body, Bloom touches a kind of wholeness without ever leaving daily life behind. Jung was deeply interested in images like this because they suggest something essential. Meaning isn't found by escaping the everyday. It's found by staying and living so fully within it that the everyday stops feeling small. This has practical application right now. When a problem appears, don't rush into action immediately. Slow down one beat. Notice the state you're in. When the urge arises to hear more advice, another explanation, another video, you can still listen, but you no longer let it pull you away. You recognize the motive behind the searching. Then you choose to stay with the present experience, rather than using insight to soothe it away. These quiet moments are where consciousness is reset each day. No ritual required. Nothing grand needed. Jung didn't see awakening as a permanent state. He saw it as an ongoing movement back to the center. So this ending isn't meant to create a feeling of arrival. It's meant to mark a shift in direction. From here, you don't have to abandon searching. But you're no longer dragged by it. You can keep walking without losing yourself on the road. Before closing, try something very gentle. Place your hand on your chest where you can feel your breath. Don't change the breath. Just notice whether it's fast or slow, shallow or deep. Then very softly ask yourself, right now, am I close to myself or am I leaving myself? You don't need a clear answer. The sensation in your body is already a response. If something softens, stay there a little longer. If there's tension, simply notice it. Perhaps that's the deepest reason this might be the last video you need. Not because you know enough. Because you no longer have to leave yourself in order to keep searching. When you stay, life no longer needs to create noise or upheaval to get your attention. And from that place, if you still take the next step, it's no longer a flight from lack. It's a steady step, awake, and sourced from within. Conclusion. By the end of this video, you may not carry a new answer, but you may be standing in a different place than where you began. Not because the world changed, because the way you stand in the world has shifted. For Carl Jung, true transformation doesn't come from understanding more. It comes from the moment consciousness stops being pulled outward and returns to its rightful place. And when that stance is established, the next steps, if there are any, will have a different quality. No longer reactions to lack, conscious choices. No longer searching to fill, exploring to understand more clearly how you're present in your own life. If the minutes you just spent helped you slow down one beat, a light can be your way of marking that moment. Not for me. For yourself, a small acknowledgement that something shifted. And subscribe not to watch countless more videos, but to keep walking together in deeper spaces of reflection. Spaces where each piece of content doesn't hold you here, but helps you stand more firmly within yourself.